Her neighbors laughed at her old garage and complained to the city. But when the inspectors came and opened the hatch in the floor, everything changed. Subscribe and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The sun rose slowly over Maplewood Lane, spilling its golden light over the manicured lawns and pastel houses of the quiet suburban street. Every driveway gleamed with polished cars, and every porch carried the same perfection: a pair of wicker chairs, a hanging fern, a welcome mat that seemed never to have known a single footprint. There was a sameness that comforted the neighbors. It meant order. It meant safety. It meant they all belonged to the same, carefully maintained dream. And then there was the small garage at the end of the lane. It sat like a forgotten relic from another time. Its paint chipped, its roof slightly uneven, its single window covered by lace curtains that had long since yellowed. To the right stood the Hendersons' 3-car brick mansion. To the left, a newly built home with solar panels and polished stone steps. Between them, the little garage looked absurd, as if it had sprouted there by mistake and refused to leave. People slowed their cars when passing, not out of curiosity anymore, but out of mild disdain, the way one glances at an untended garden in a street of perfect lawns. Inside that modest structure lived Evelyn Grant, a 73-year-old widow, whom most of the neighborhood had decided was, at best, eccentric, and at worst, completely unhinged. She moved quietly, with the measured rhythm of someone who had learned to take up as little space in the world as possible. Every morning, she stepped out in the same faded blue work overalls, her silver hair tied back in a neat bun, her movements precise and unhurried. She would sweep the short walkway, wipe dust from her old mailbox, and adjust the small flower pots that lined her fence. In the afternoons, she tinkered with tools no one recognized, cutting wood, sanding, sketching small designs on scraps of paper. At dusk, she would sit for a few minutes on the low concrete step, staring at the horizon until the street lights flickered on, and then retreat inside, closing the garage door behind her. No one knew what she did all day. Rumors filled the gaps. Some said she lived off government aid. Others whispered that she hoarded things inside, that the garage was filled to the ceiling with junk and maybe even rats. Mr. Henderson, the realtor next door, swore she was hiding something illegal. His wife believed Evelyn was simply lonely, too proud to accept help. Their children called her the Cave Lady and made a game of tossing pebbles at her mailbox before running away laughing. Evelyn never responded. She would pick up the pebbles one by one, drop them quietly into her apron pocket, and go back to her work. But behind her, silence was not weakness. It was discipline. It was the habit of a mind trained long ago to measure, to calculate, to build. Decades earlier, Evelyn had been an architect, one of the first women in her firm, working in a field that barely tolerated her presence. She had built schools, libraries, modest homes for people who could not afford extravagance. Her designs were known for balance and light spaces that breathed, that invited calm. She and her husband George had shared that vision, two dreamers who believed that the right kind of home could heal a life. Together, they had built their own small house on this same plot of land, back when Maplewood Lane was just a dirt road bordered by pines. They had imagined staying there forever. Forever lasted less than 20 years. Their son, Daniel, died young, and George followed only 2 years later, his heart giving out on a rain-soaked afternoon. Evelyn had never truly recovered. The big house felt haunted, too full of echoes, too full of air she could no longer breathe. She sold most of the structure to developers and kept only the portion that once held George's workshop. When the new houses rose around her, she refused to move. Her neighbors called it stubbornness. In truth, it was something quieter, an anchor to memory, a refusal to erase what little of her life still remained her own. Time passed, and the street changed. The pines were cut down, the air filled with the hum of sprinklers and leaf blowers. New families moved in with their energy and their rules. Evelyn became an unwanted relic, yet she stayed. Every board, every nail in that garage, she knew by heart. She had repaired it herself, painted it herself, and when age made climbing ladders difficult, she simply stopped caring about the peeling paint. From the outside, her life looked small, but inside, she had learned to breathe in the space no one saw. The evenings were her favorite. When the last neighbor's car pulled into the driveway and the last dog barked its tired bark, she would close her curtains and lock the door. Then she would lift the corner of an old rug in the center of the floor, revealing a hidden metal latch. Her fingers, though thin and veined, still moved with practiced strength. She turned the handle, and with a faint mechanical hum, a section of the concrete floor began to rise. Beneath it waited a narrow staircase, descending into the earth. She would take a flashlight from the wall, step carefully down, and pull the floor back into place above her, leaving the world behind. Below the garage stretched a different kind of home, a secret world carved from patience and grief. Stone walls curved like ribs, holding in the coolness of the earth. The air was dry, but faintly perfumed with cedar and machine oil. She had built everything herself over years. Shelves from reclaimed oak, a table from an old church pew, a small stove, and even a simple water system that filtered rain through sand and gravel. It was not a bunker or a hiding place. It was a continuation of the life she had once shared with Georgia House beneath the world's noise, designed for peace. There was a library there, a long, narrow room with shelves reaching the ceiling. Each book bore a small handwritten tag in her careful script. There were manuals of architecture, old novels, journals, poetry, and notebooks filled with her own sketches. The air smelled faintly of ink and dust, and when the lights hummed on, the place looked less like a cellar and more like a hidden museum. In the far corner stood a table scattered with models of houses, bridges, towers, tiny cities made from wood, cardboard, and glass. It was here that Evelyn still built, in miniature, what the world had never let her build in life. Past the library was a second room, smaller, warmer. On the wall hung photographs of George and Daniel, their smiles faded, but still alive in the soft lamplight. The bed was narrow, but neatly made. At the foot of it sat a small chest containing her husband's tools, each cleaned and polished, though she rarely used them now. In another corner, a small electric heater ticked softly, adding a faint rhythm to the silence. It was, in its way, the most human place in the world. Sometimes she spoke aloud there. She would tell George about her day, about the things she overheard from the street above, the new couple who argued about fences, the boy who broke a mailbox, the realtor next door trying to sell yet another house. Her voice echoed gently in the curved ceiling, and she would imagine for a moment that someone answered back. When she tired, she would close her eyes and listen to the hum of the ventilation system, the steady heartbeat of the world she had built with her own hands. Years had passed since she last invited anyone inside, and no one suspected the truth. From the street, her garage looked almost abandoned, and that suited her. She wanted to be invisible, to live in the space between notice and neglect. But the world above had a way of intruding, even into silence. Lately, she had noticed the Hendersons watching more closely. They had complained before about her overgrown hedges, about the look of her fence. Now she often caught them whispering when she walked by, their voices rising with the smugness of people convinced of their own importance. One morning, she found a city notice pinned to her fence. The words were neat, official, printed in the dry language of regulation. A request for inspection concerning possible unapproved structural modifications. Someone had reported her. She folded the letter, slipped it into her apron, and went back inside. For a long time, she stood at the top of the hidden staircase, the light from above cutting across her face like a question. Then, almost imperceptibly, she smiled, a tired, knowing smile, the kind that belongs to someone who has already lost everything once and has nothing left to fear. That night, she spent hours below ground, cleaning, organizing, checking every corner. She wasn't preparing to hide anything. She was preparing to be seen. She wiped the dust from the glass case that held her old architectural license, now faded and yellow. She polished the wooden rail of the staircase, tested the light switches, and replaced the batteries in the emergency lamps. When she finished, she sat in the small library with a cup of tea, the steam curling against the stone. Above her, the house slept, unaware that beneath its feet lay a secret more extraordinary than any of them could imagine. Outside, the streetlights blinked against the coming fog. A dog barked twice, then went silent. In the distance, the faint hum of tires rolled across the asphalt. Evelyn listened, letting the familiar sounds fold around her. The world above would soon come knocking, full of judgment and rules. But for now, beneath the garage they laughed at, the old woman sat in her hidden world, calm and unafraid. And as she closed her eyes that night, she knew something that none of her neighbors ever would, that sometimes the smallest, most overlooked place on the surface can hold beneath it a whole universe, waiting to be discovered. The following morning came with the weight of quiet inevitability. The letter from the city rested on the kitchen table, its sharp folds cutting through the gentle disarray of Evelyn's life like a blade. She had slept little, though the night itself had been peaceful. The world above her head had moved on, unaware that something in its careful order was about to change. When dawn reached through the small window above the sink, she stood with a cup of tea in her hand and looked out over her tiny patch of grass. The dew glistened on the weeds, and for a brief moment, the world seemed tender, forgiving. Then, as if remembering itself, it turned cold again. She folded the letter once more and placed it neatly into a drawer. It was time to face what was coming. Evelyn moved through her morning routine with the precision of habit. She swept the step, wiped dust from the mailbox, arranged the same flower pots in the same order. From across the fence, she could feel the eyes of her neighbors. The Hendersons' curtains shifted, revealing the faint outline of two faces peering through. She pretended not to notice. It was strange how predictably people behaved when they thought someone else's life needed correction. A rumor, a whisper, a spark of envy, that was all it took for a small storm to brew. But Evelyn had lived through far greater storms than this. When the white van finally appeared at the end of Maplewood Lane 2 days later, she was already outside, standing by the garage door. The van turned into her short gravel driveway and stopped. The logo on its side was plain: City Inspection Department. The letters were stenciled in blue, as impersonal as the men who stepped out. One was young, barely in his 20s, with a crisp clipboard and the stiff posture of someone trying to look authoritative. The other was older, maybe 50, tall, lean, with a face that carried more exhaustion than judgment. His name, stitched onto his jacket, read, T. Moore. "Mrs. Grant?" the older man asked. His voice was polite, steady, without condescension. Evelyn nodded. "Yes. You're here about the structure." He blinked, surprised by her composure. "Yes, ma'am. We received a complaint. We'll just have a quick look around if that's all right." "Of course," she said, stepping aside. The younger inspector, whose name she would later learn was Alex, began taking photographs immediately. The shutter clicked rhythmically, documenting every imperfection, the peeling paint, the uneven roof, the worn-out hinges. Evelyn followed them quietly as they circled the small building. From the street, several curtains fluttered as neighbors tried to watch without being seen. The air hummed with invisible curiosity. Inside, the garage was exactly what anyone would expect. A workbench, a few wooden crates, an old stool, shelves with tools and brushes, a collection of jars filled with nails and screws. Everything was clean, ordered, and harmless. The inspectors exchanged a glance. "Seems fine up here," Alex muttered, almost disappointed. But Thomas Moore didn't move on. He stood near the center of the floor, head slightly tilted, listening. Then he crouched, pressing a hand to the concrete as if testing its pulse. "You've done some recent work here, haven't you?" he asked without accusation. Evelyn met his gaze. "I maintain what's mine," she said simply. He nodded slowly. "Mind if I check something?" She hesitated, then sighed. "You'll find it either way." Thomas stepped closer to the corner, where the rug met the floor. With practiced care, he lifted it, revealing the faint outline of a metal seam. The younger inspector leaned forward, eyes wide. "What is that?" Evelyn exhaled softly, as if releasing a secret she had carried too long. "A door," she said, "to my home." The older man's eyebrows rose. "A basement? You could call it that." He straightened. "We'll need to take a look." "I thought you might," she said. When she turned the handle, the mechanism responded with a low hum. The concrete panel rose slowly, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. A breath of cool air drifted up, carrying the faint smell of earth and cedar. The two men exchanged a quick, uncertain look, and then Thomas nodded for Alex to follow. Evelyn went first, her movements steady, sure. The descent was brief but transformative. The noise of the world faded, replaced by the hush of the underground. At the bottom of the stairs, light bloomed softly. Warm, golden, alive. The inspectors stopped in silence. Before them stretched a space they could not have imagined. It was not large, but it was magnificent in its precision. Curved stone walls framed a room that felt like a memory turned tangible. Shelves filled with books, models of buildings, drawings pinned neatly in rows. Wooden furniture, polished to a gentle sheen. Everything had purpose, order, and the unmistakable touch of a designer's hand. "My God," whispered Alex. "You built all this?" Evelyn nodded. "Every inch." Thomas walked forward slowly, touching the wall with his palm. "This isn't amateur work," he said. "You reinforced the ceiling steel beams, ventilation ducts. You even installed independent power." "I was an architect," she said. "Once." He turned to look at her. Then, really look at her. The old woman standing calmly in her underground masterpiece, her back straight, her eyes tired, but unwavering. There was no deceit in her, only quiet pride. "How long has this been here?" "Since 1992, she replied. "I started after my husband died. It was supposed to be temporary. Then the world above became less livable." The younger man's expression softened. "Why didn't you just ask for permits? You could have gotten approval for an extension." Evelyn smiled faintly. "Permits are for people who want permission. I needed peace." Thomas said nothing. He walked deeper into the room, examining the craftsmanship, the symmetrical arches, the careful ventilation shafts hidden in the corners, the old blueprints framed on the walls. Everything was structurally sound, perfectly balanced. It was the kind of precision that came only from someone who both understood and loved their craft. "You realize this violates several zoning laws," he said at last. living space beneath an unregistered structure, no emergency access, no environmental inspection. I realize, she said softly, and you understand we'll have to file a report. I understand that too. She said it without defiance, without plea. Her acceptance disarmed him. For a moment, Thomas forgot his clipboard, forgot his training. He saw not a violation, but a legacy. A woman who had turned her grief into geometry, her solitude into architecture. Alex, less burdened by years of bureaucracy, could not contain his admiration. "This is incredible," he said. "It's like something out of a story." Evelyn's eyes flickered toward him, grateful but cautious. "It's only a house," she said. "A quiet one?" After they finished their inspection, Thomas took a few photographs, his hand moving slower now, less clinical. He could not help but feel the strangeness of it, the beauty of something built against the rules, but not against reason. He found himself imagining her here at night, reading by the warm light, surrounded by the ghosts of her life. When they returned to the surface, the daylight felt harsher. The street seemed smaller, pettier, like a place that could not comprehend what lay beneath it. The neighbors were watching again. A child stood by the Hendersons' fence, staring with wide eyes. Evelyn closed the door behind her, the sound echoing like the ending of a secret. Thomas filled out his preliminary notes. "We'll have to issue a notice," he said quietly. "It's just procedure. There'll likely be a fine, maybe more. I'll recommend an evaluation before any enforcement." "Do what you must," she said. He hesitated. "You've done something remarkable here. Not many could." She looked at him then, her expression unreadable. Remarkable isn't always permitted. That night, Evelyn returned to her underground home and sat at her work table. The hum of the ventilation system sounded louder than usual, like a second heartbeat. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down, not in fear, but in inevitability. The inspection had gone as expected. Still, something lingered, an unfamiliar sense of exposure. For decades, her world had existed in silence. Now, it had witnesses. The following week, the official report arrived. The city declared her dwelling unauthorized residential construction. She was fined, warned of possible demolition if the site was not brought into compliance. Her name appeared on a list of minor infractions. Just another case in a bureaucratic system that measured lives in violations and fees. The Hendersons gloated openly. She heard their laughter through the fence as they told the story to friends. "They found an old mole living under her garage," Mr. Henderson said one evening, his voice carrying across the lawns. "A whole house underground. Can you believe it?" Evelyn did not answer. She spent her nights as before, reading, sketching, existing between two worlds. Yet something had shifted. She could no longer pretend her solitude was invisible. The city had marked her now, and the neighbors had turned her existence into entertainment. But there was one detail she hadn't expected. A second letter, hand-delivered, unsigned. It contained only a single line, written in firm, deliberate handwriting. "I've seen what you built. It deserves to be preserved, not destroyed." There was no name, only an address, the City Inspection Department. She recognized the handwriting at once. Thomas Moore. It was the first time in years that Evelyn felt something like gratitude stir within her. She placed the letter on her desk and looked around at the quiet beauty of her hidden home. Perhaps not everyone above ground was blind. Perhaps, against all odds, someone understood. Still, she knew the battle was only beginning. The city would not leave her alone. Papers would follow, meetings, arguments. The law did not care for the elegance of intention. It demanded conformity. Yet as she sat beneath the earth, surrounded by the evidence of her life's quiet rebellion, she found no fear in her heart. only a strange calm, and a single thought that rose like a whisper in the still air. If they were going to take her home from her, they would at least have to look her in the eyes when they did it. Outside, the spring wind moved through the street, stirring the neat rows of lawns and fences. From above, the little garage looked as small and insignificant as ever. But deep below it, in a place of stone and silence, Evelyn Grant waited, not to surrender, but to be seen. The story spread faster than Evelyn could have imagined. Within days of the inspection report, photographs of her hidden home began to appear online. At first it was local news, a short article titled, "Elderly Woman Builds Secret Underground, Dwelling Beneath Her Garage." By the end of the week, the story had crossed state lines, shared and reshared by people who would never set foot on Maplewood Lane. The photographs showed the warm stone walls, the arched ceiling, the library that looked like something from another century. Words like mystery, genius, and defiance followed her name. What had been her quiet sanctuary was now a public marvel. For Evelyn, the sudden attention was almost surreal. She lived as she always had, following her small routines, but she could no longer pretend that the outside world was unaware of her existence. Cars she didn't recognize began to drive slowly past her house. Strangers paused by her fence, whispering, pointing their phones. The Hendersons, who had once ridiculed her, now spoke of her with rehearsed fascination, telling visitors, "We've lived next to her for years, you know. We always suspected something unusual about that garage." The hypocrisy didn't bother her anymore. She had seen too much of human nature to be surprised by its shifts. What unsettled her was not the gossip itself, but the way it distorted everything she had built into spectacle. One morning, a letter arrived from the city, an official notice that a public hearing had been scheduled to determine the fate of her home. She had 3 weeks to appear before the municipal board. The charges were predictable: unpermitted construction, residential violation, safety concerns. The letter listed penalties and fines, the language sharp, devoid of empathy. Yet beneath its legal phrasing, Evelyn felt something else, an acknowledgement that her creation had become too visible to ignore. She folded the paper carefully and placed it on her table. The thought of strangers debating the worth of her life's work filled her with both dread and weary amusement. Thomas Moore visited her a few days later. He came without his city badge this time, dressed in plain clothes, holding a paper bag with 2 cups of coffee. Evelyn found him standing by the garage, hesitant, but determined. She opened the door before he could knock. "You shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "I know," he replied, offering one of the cups. "But I needed to tell you something. The city's not interested in destroying what you built. They're interested in protecting themselves. There's a difference." She took the coffee, her hand steady despite the storm she felt brewing inside. "You mean they'll do whatever looks safest in the headlines?" He almost smiled. "You're not wrong, but I'll be at the hearing. I'm not allowed to speak on your behalf, not officially, but there are ways to make sure your story is told properly." "You believe it's worth saving?" she asked. "I believe it's the kind of place that reminds us why rules exist, to protect, not to erase. And sometimes, the only way to prove that is by breaking them." She said nothing, but her eyes softened. For years she had lived unseen, unheard. Now, of all people, it was a city inspector who understood. When he left, she returned to her desk and began writing a letter, her statement for the hearing. She didn't write to defend herself. She wrote to explain why her home existed. Every word was deliberate, measured, stripped of sentimentality. She described how architecture had always been her language, how the act of building had kept her alive when everything else was lost. "I didn't create this house to hide from the world," she wrote. "I created it because the world above had forgotten what a home is meant to be. The day of the hearing came gray and damp. The city hall was crowded. Journalists, curious residents, officials trying to appear impartial. Evelyn arrived alone, wearing a simple gray coat and carrying a folder under her arm. As she walked down the narrow aisle to the front of the chamber, the whispers followed her like a current. On the panel sat 5 officials behind a polished oak table, and among them was Thomas, seated slightly apart, his expression composed but alert. The hearing began with procedural formality. A city attorney read out the violations in a monotonous voice. Unauthorized dwelling, failure to comply with zoning regulations, potential safety hazards. Evelyn listened without reaction. She had expected this part to be sterile, almost mechanical. It was the next phase. The testimonies that would reveal the truth of what her home meant. When her turn came, she rose slowly, the papers in her hands trembling slightly, though her voice, when it came, was clear and firm. "You see violations," she began, "but what I built was never meant to defy the law. It was meant to preserve what was human. You have rules that decide where a person can sleep, how high a wall can rise, how deep a foundation may go. I understand those rules. I wrote some of them myself when I was still an architect. But there is one thing they cannot legislate: the need for peace." She paused, letting the silence expand. Even the reporters stopped typing. "I built that home with my own hands, not for profit, not for pride. I built it because after losing my family, I needed a place where grief could breathe without interruption. It's not a threat to anyone. It doesn't block sunlight or trespass beyond my boundaries. It is my life's work, and perhaps the only true thing I have left to leave behind." When she finished, she sat down quietly. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the city attorney began listing technicalities again, but his words seemed to dissolve into the air. The human part of the room had already shifted. Thomas stood next. He was not supposed to speak, but he did. He described what he had seen underground, how the structure was sound, how the design met more safety standards than most licensed homes. His tone remained professional, but there was something in it, a conviction that made his colleagues uneasy. "Mrs. Grant's dwelling is unconventional," he said, "but it's not dangerous. It represents craftsmanship, discipline, and a respect for space that our regulations were meant to protect, not punish. The law should serve people like her, not destroy them." The board deliberated for nearly an hour. Evelyn waited in silence, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Through the window, she could see the rain beginning to fall, streaking the glass in slow, silver lines. When the verdict finally came, the room seemed to exhale. The decision was unanimous. She would keep her underground home. There would be a fine, modest enough to save face, and she would be required to install a few additional safety features, a secondary vent, an updated electrical inspection. But the house itself would remain. A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Evelyn didn't smile. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging something inevitable. Thomas caught her eye and gave a small, respectful bow of the head. It was enough. In the weeks that followed, the story only grew. Journalists called her the woman who built her heart underground. Artists painted her home. Architects cited her as a symbol of independent design. Tourists tried to visit Maplewood Lane, hoping to glimpse the famous garage. Evelyn refused every interview, ignored every request for comment. She had no interest in becoming a symbol. The true victory was not the public's fascination. It was the right to live quietly once more. The neighbors changed their tune. Mrs. Henderson brought a basket of muffins one morning, pretending it was a gesture of goodwill. Mr. Henderson talked about collaborating on a documentary. Evelyn thanked them both, accepted the muffins, and closed her door. The gossip gradually faded. Curiosity gave way to the next story, the next outrage. Life returned to its small rhythms, though nothing felt quite the same. One evening, long after the noise had subsided, Evelyn descended the familiar staircase again. The air below was cool and still, carrying the soft hum of the ventilation she had installed decades ago. She walked slowly through the rooms, her hand trailing along the stone walls. Everything was as it had always been: the books, the models, the quiet hum of the lamp. But something within her had changed. For the first time, she felt seen, not as an oddity, but as a maker. She stopped before the old photograph of George and Daniel. "We're safe now," she whispered. They wanted to take it, but they couldn't. Her voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with release. She turned on the small heater, poured herself tea, and sat at her table. The world above buzzed faintly, distant, unimportant. Here, the light was soft, the air steady. She opened her sketchbook, the same one she had used for years, and began to draw not new structures, but pieces of the one she had already built, as if mapping the contours of her own soul. Every line was an act of remembrance, every shadow a fragment of love. Later that night, when she finally stood to go to bed, she paused at the base of the staircase. The faint sound of rain filtered through the ceiling, mingling with the steady pulse of her ventilation. Above ground, the garage was still just a small, unremarkable box between two towering houses. But beneath it, something extraordinary breathed. A home, born not from rebellion, but from devotion. Weeks passed, and the outside world moved on. Yet sometimes, a visitor still came. A reporter, a student, a stranger. They would stand at her gate, uncertain whether to knock. Evelyn never opened the door. She would simply watch from the small window until they left. Her world had already been revealed once. She had no need to reveal it again. On one of those evenings, a letter arrived. The handwriting was neat and familiar. Inspected. All systems sound. Your home is safer than most above ground. No signature was needed. She smiled, folded the paper, and placed it beside the first letter Thomas had written months before. That night, as she sat in her underground garden, the lamps casting a soft glow over the stone, she understood what she had truly built. It wasn't a house. It was a promise to herself, to the people she had lost, to the idea that peace could exist, even beneath the weight of judgment. Outside, the street slept. The Hendersons' lights were off, the lawns glistened with dew. From above, her garage looked as ordinary as ever, a small, fading structure swallowed by the night. But below, in the hidden world she had carved with her hands and her grief, Evelyn Grant sat surrounded by the quiet light of her creation. The world had tried to expose her, to shrink her life into a headline, and yet, beneath the surface, she remained unshaken, a woman who had built not to escape, but to endure. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more true stories like this one. Watch the next video, and share this one with someone who would understand.